Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked into the great chamber of the Galactic Council for what she knew would be her final time as Earth's representative to the stars. The chamber stretched impossibly high above her head, and the walls were made of living crystal that had grown over thousands of years, and each surface reflected the light of 100 distant suns that the elder races had collected as trophies of their ancient conquests. She had stood in this room 47 times over 30 years, and each time the weight of alien contempt had pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. Around the circular hall sat the representatives of 12 species who had ruled the galaxy since before humanity had learned to use fire, the Velith. Delegation occupied the northern section, and their biomechanical bodies clicked and whirred with quiet mockery whenever a human spoke and their optical sensors tracked. Elena like predators watching wounded prey, the sorry collective floated in suspension fields to her left, and their gaseous forms shifted through colors that expressed emotions too complex for human understanding and right. Now those colors spelled nothing but dismissal. High Arbiter Desix towered above them all from the central platform, and his crystalline body had grown for over 50,000 years, and each facet of his form contained the memories of civilizations that had risen and fallen while humanity still lived in caves. Elena activated her translation implant and stepped forward to the speaking circle. Honored members of the Galactic Council, she began, and her voice echoed through the vast space with a confidence she did not feel. I come before you today with the same warning I have brought for 3 decades, and I come with new evidence that demands your immediate attention. A ripple of amusement passed through the assembled delegates, and the Velith clicked louder, and the Thesari shifted to shades of pale blue that indicated boredom. Elena ignored them and activated the holographic display she had brought from Earth. The image showed the edge of the galaxy, as seen from humanity's most advanced deep space observatory, and at first glance it looked like any other star field with millions of points of light scattered across the darkness. This image was taken 50 years ago, Elena said, and then she changed the display. And this image was taken last month. The difference was subtle but terrifying. A section of the star field had simply vanished, and where thousands of stars had once burned, there was now only empty blackness, and the void had grown since the last time she had shown them evidence, and 17 more star systems had disappeared into nothing. The phenomenon we call the silence has consumed over 200 star systems in the past century. Elena continued, and her voice grew stronger with urgency. Our long-range sensors detect no debris and no radiation, and no sign that these systems ever existed at all, and something is erasing reality itself, and it is moving toward the heart of the galaxy. High Arbiter Desix made a sound like wind chimes in a storm, and his translator rendered it as patient condescension. Ambassador Vasquez, he said, and each word dripped with the weight of millennia. The Galactic Council has monitored this region of space for longer than your species has possessed language, and our sensors, which are far more sophisticated than anything humanity has yet developed, show nothing unusual, and stars die, and young species sometimes mistake natural phenomena for cosmic threats. Your sensors are not designed to detect absence, Elena replied, and she felt her frustration rising despite her best efforts. You are looking for energy signatures and gravitational anomalies and signals of destruction, but the silence leaves nothing behind, and it does not destroy in any way. You understand, and it simply removes. The Velith delegate rose from his seat, and his mechanical body unfolded to its full intimidating height. Perhaps, he said, with clicks that the translator rendered as barely concealed contempt, the humans should focus on mastering basic interstellar travel before lecturing civilizations that built empires when their ancestors were still learning to walk upright. And it is adorable that they believe they have discovered something we have missed, but it is also tiresome. Laughter echoed through the chamber, and even species that rarely agreed with the Velith joined in the mockery. Elena stood her ground and she thought of her daughter back on Earth and her granddaughter, who had just been born, and she thought of all the humans who had looked up at the stars with wonder and hope, and she felt the weight of their future pressing down on her. "I have spent 30 years in this chamber," she said, and her voice cut through the laughter with an edge of steel. "I have presented evidence and pleaded for cooperation and begged for you to simply look at what we have found, and each time you have dismissed humanity as children who do not understand the universe." She paused and looked around the room at the ancient beings who held the fate of countless worlds in their hands. "You are right that we are young," she continued. "You are right that we have much to learn, and you are right that your civilizations achieved greatness while we were still discovering fire. But you were wrong about one crucial thing." The chamber fell silent, and even the Veleth stopped their clicking. "You have forgotten what it means to be afraid," Elena said. "You have ruled the galaxy for so long that you cannot imagine anything threatening your existence, and your sensors do not detect the silence because you have stopped looking for dangers, and you have grown complacent in your power and comfortable in your immortality." High Arbiter Desix leaned forward, and his crystalline form caught the light in ways that made him seem to tower even higher. "And what would humanity do differently?" he asked with something that might have been genuine curiosity buried beneath layers of condescension. "What great wisdom do the young apes of Earth possess that has escaped 200,000 years of galactic civilization?" Elena smiled, and it was not a happy expression. "We would prepare," she said simply. "We would build and plan and ready ourselves for the worst, because that is what humans do, and we have survived ice ages and asteroids and plagues and wars. And we have survived because we never assume we are safe, and we never stop expecting disaster." She gathered her materials and turned toward the exit. "This is my last appearance before this council," she announced. "Earth will no longer waste resources begging for your attention, and from this day forward humanity will prepare alone, and we will build what we need to survive. And when the silence comes for you, and it will come then perhaps, you will remember that we tried to warn you." The Arbiter made a dismissive harmonic, and the Veleth resumed their mocking clicks, and the Dasari shifted to colors of complete disinterest. "Return to your small world," the Arbiter said. "Grow for a few more millennia and learn perspective, and when you have matured, perhaps we will discuss your concerns." Elena paused at the chamber door and looked back one final time at the assembled representatives of galactic power. "We alerted you," she said quietly. "Remember that, and remember that you chose not to listen." Then she walked out, and the great doors closed behind her, and the Galactic Council returned to their ancient business without another thought for the young species. From the small blue world, they had already forgotten her before she reached her ship. They would remember her words much later when the stars began to vanish around them, and by then, it would be far too late. 20 years had passed since Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked out of the Galactic Council chamber for the last time. Deep beneath the frozen surface of Luna in tunnels that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, General Marcus Chen stood before a holographic display that showed the full scope of humanity's secret project. He was an old man, now with gray hair and deep lines carved into his face by decades of worry and responsibility, but his eyes remained sharp and his mind remained focused on the single goal that had consumed his entire adult life. "Show me the fleet status," he commanded, and the display shifted to reveal 12 separate battle groups hidden throughout the Sol system. The ships were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, where the elder races built elegant vessels of living crystal and organic metal. Humanity had constructed weapons of war that reflected their species' brutal history, and every ship bristled with technology born from paranoia and desperation and the absolute refusal to go quietly into the dark. Battle Group Alpha is at 93% readiness, his aide reported, and she was a young woman named Lieutenant Yuki Vasquez, who carried her grandmother's name and her grandmother's determination. Battle Groups Beta through Delta are fully operational, and the remaining 8 groups will complete construction within the next 18 months. Marcus nodded and pulled up another display showing the 47 ARC ships that humanity had built in secret, and each vessel was capable of carrying 10 million people in suspended animation, and each was equipped with everything needed to rebuild human civilization from nothing. And the weapon systems? He asked. Project Last Light is ready for deployment. Yuki answered, and there was something like awe in her voice. The dimensional anchors have been tested on a small scale, and the theoretical models suggest they will function as designed. Marcus turned away from the displays and walked to the observation window that looked out over the vast underground shipyard, and below him thousands of workers moved between the massive vessels, and sparks flew from welding torches, and the sound of construction echoed through the cavern like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. The council sent another inspection request this morning, Yuki said. They want to know why we have restricted all travel to the Sol system, and they are growing suspicious. Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity of it. For 200 years the elder races had treated humanity like children playing with dangerous toys, and they had mocked human technology and dismissed human concerns and refused to take anything from Earth seriously. Now that the children had locked their door and stopped asking for permission, suddenly the adults were curious about what was happening inside. Deny the request, Marcus ordered. Cite internal security concerns and sovereign territorial rights, and whatever else the diplomats think will buy us more time. They will not be satisfied with that answer. They do not need to be satisfied, Marcus replied. They only need to stay out of our way for another 2 years, and by then it will not matter what they think. He turned back to the display and pulled up the long-range sensor data that humanity had been collecting in secret for decades. The silence had grown. It now consumed nearly 400 star systems, and its advance had accelerated in recent years, as if it was hungry and growing stronger with each meal. And the leading edge of the void was now less than 5,000 light years from the nearest colony of the Velith. They still do not see it coming, Yuki said quietly, and there was no satisfaction in her voice, only sadness. Their sensors are not designed to detect absence, Marcus replied, and he echoed the words Elena had spoken to the council so many years ago. They look for energy, and radiation and mass, and the silence is none of those things, and by the time they understand what is happening, their worlds will already be gone. Yuki was silent for a moment, and then she asked the question that had haunted humanity's leadership. For 2 decades, why are we including evacuation protocols for them? She asked. After everything they did to us, and everything they said, and all the times they laughed at us and dismissed us, why are we planning to save them? Marcus walked to his desk and picked up an old photograph that showed a young woman standing before the Galactic Council. And Ambassador Almea Vasquez had never stopped believing that humanity could be better than the species who mocked them. Because that is what your grandmother would have wanted, he said simply. Because the measure of a species is not how they treat those who respect them, but how they treat those who do not. And because if we let them die when we could have saved them, then we become exactly what they accused us of being. He set the photograph down and turned back to the displays. Humanity spent most of its history fighting itself, he continued. We killed each other over land and resources and ideas and beliefs, and we came so close to destroying ourselves so many times that it is a miracle we survived long enough to reach the stars. But we did survive, Yuki said. We did. Marcus agreed. And somewhere along the way we learned that survival alone is not enough, and that a species that only cares about itself does not deserve to exist, and that the universe is too vast and too dangerous for anyone to face alone. He pulled up a new display showing the evacuation plans that humanity had developed in secret. There were protocols for every species in the galaxy, and detailed plans for reaching their worlds and extracting their populations and transporting them to safety, and humanity had designed ships specifically configured to support the biological needs of each alien race. They will not thank us, Yuki said. They will not even understand why we did it. Probably not, Marcus admitted. But we will know, and our children will know, and their children will know, and that is enough. Alert flashed across the main display, and Marcus felt his heart stop for a moment before he recognized it as a routine communication. General, a voice said through the speakers. Long-range sensors have detected increased activity at the edge of the silence, and the void is accelerating, and our models suggest it will reach the first populated systems within 5 years. Marcus closed his eyes and took a deep breath, and when he opened them again, his face was set with grim determination. Send the word to all shipyards, he ordered. Construction timeline is moved up by 12 months, and I want all battle groups at full readiness within 18 months and begin quiet evacuation of non-essential personnel from outer colonies. Yuki nodded and moved to carry out his orders, but Marcus called her back. Lieutenant, he said, and his voice was softer now. When this is over, and if we survive, I want you to remember something. Sir, your grandmother spent her whole life trying to save people who refused to believe they needed saving, and she died without knowing if any of it mattered, and she deserves to be remembered as a hero. Yuki straightened and something fierce burned in her eyes. She will be remembered, she promised. I will make sure of it. Then she turned and walked away to help prepare humanity for the war that was coming. In the shipyard below, the sounds of construction grew louder and faster as workers labored through the night to build the weapons that would stand between the galaxy and oblivion. The elder races had no idea what was coming. But humanity did, and this time they would be ready. It had stood for over 60,000 years as the jewel of their empire, and its towers of living metal had reached toward the sky like fingers grasping for the stars, and its population of 12 billion had believed with absolute certainty that their civilization would last forever. They were wrong. Captain Sarah Okonkwo watched the destruction from the bridge of the human evacuation vessel Hopes. Light in her hands gripped the armrests of her command chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The silence moved across the Veloth system like a wave of absolute nothing, and it did not burn or explode or destroy in any way that made sense, and it simply erased. One moment the outer planets existed, and the next moment they did not, and there was no debris and no radiation and no sign they had ever been real at all. How long until it reaches the homeworld? Sarah asked, and her voice was steady despite the horror unfolding before her. 6 hours at current rate of advance, her tactical officer replied. Maybe less if it accelerates again. Sarah turned to her communications officer. What is the status of the evacuation? We have 17 vessels in orbit around the Veloth homeworld, the officer reported. Current extraction rate is approximately 2 million civilians per hour, but the Veloth government is refusing to cooperate, and they are telling their people that the human ships are a trick. Sarah felt a surge of frustration, so powerful it almost made her scream. For decades humanity had tried to warn the galaxy, and for decades they had been mocked and dismissed. And now the very species who had laughed loudest were refusing to accept salvation because they could not believe that the primitive humans might actually save them. Open a channel to the Veloth High Command, she ordered. Captain, they have rejected our last 12 attempts at communication. Open the channel anyway. The view screen flickered, and the face of a Veloth commander appeared, and his biomechanical features were arranged in an expression of contempt that Sarah had learned to recognize over years of dealing with his kind human vessel. The Veloth said, and his translator rendered the clicking sounds of his language into cold, precise words. You have entered Veloth space without authorization, and you will withdraw immediately or face destruction. Sarah leaned forward in her chair, and she did not bother to hide her anger. "Look behind you," she said simply. The Velith commander paused, and something in his optical sensors flickered with confusion. "Your outer colonies are gone," Sarah continued. "Your fleet stationed at the third moon is gone, and in 6 hours your homeworld will be gone too. And I have 17 ships that can save millions of your people, but only if you stop being too proud to accept help. This is some human trick." The commander insisted, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Your species has always been jealous of Velith's superiority, and this is merely another attempt to undermine our authority. We warned you," Sarah said, and the words came out harder than she intended. "Ambassador Vasquez stood before your representatives and begged you to listen, and you laughed at her and called us children, and now the darkness she warned you about is eating your empire, and you are still too arrogant to accept that she was right." The Velith commander was silent, and behind him Sarah could see other Velith officers moving frantically as reports flooded in from across the system. 6 hours. Sarah repeated, "That is all the time your species is left, unless you let us help, and I do not care if you thank us, and I do not care if you ever admit we were right, but I will not sit here and watch 12 billion people die because their leaders were too proud to accept rescue." The commander's optical sensors dimmed, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its contempt. "Why would you save us?" he asked, and he sounded genuinely confused. "We treated you kind with nothing but disdain, and we blocked your advancement, and we refused to share technology, and we laughed when your ambassador warned us about this very threat." Sarah stood up from her chair and walked closer to the view screen. "Because someone had to be ready," she said, "and you were too old to remember how to be afraid, and we are not saving you because you deserve it, and we are not saving you because we expect gratitude, and we are saving you because that is who we are." She gestured to her tactical officer. "We have detailed evacuation protocols for Velith physiology," she continued. "Our ships are equipped with atmosphere processors that can sustain your people and suspension chambers designed for your biology. And we have been preparing for this day for 20 years while you were busy ignoring the end of the universe." The Velith commander stood motionless for a long moment, and the other officers on his bridge had stopped moving and were staring at the human captain on their view screen. 20 years, he repeated slowly. "You knew this was coming for 20 years, and you prepared to save us anyway." "We prepared to save everyone," Sarah replied. "Every species in the galaxy and every world that can be reached in time, because humanity learned a long time ago that survival means nothing if you have to become monsters to achieve it." The commander turned to look at something off-screen, and when he turned back his posture had changed completely. "The silence has reached our 4th planet," he said, and his voice cracked with something that might have been grief. 300 million people, and now there is nothing but void." "Then stop wasting time," Sarah said firmly but not unkindly. "Order your people to the evacuation points, and tell your ships to assist with transport, and let us do what we came here to do." The Velith commander nodded slowly and issued orders in his own language and across the planet below. The massive screens in every city began displaying instructions. "For evacuation to human vessels, Captain," he said before closing the channel. "I do not understand your species, and I do not know why you would help those who wronged you, but I will remember this day. Make sure your children remember too," Sarah replied, "and their children and all the generations that come after, because the silence is not finished, and one day you may need to stand beside us instead of above us." The channel closed, and Sarah turned to her crew. "All ships begin emergency extraction protocols," she ordered. "I want every transport running continuous cycles until we have loaded every person we can reach and someone get a status report from the other evacuation fleets." Her communications officer looked up with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "Captain, the Council is demanding to speak with Earth Command, and they want to know how we knew this would happen, and they want access to our long-range sensor data." Sarah allowed herself a small bitter smile. "Tell them to wait," she said. "We are busy saving the people they were supposed to protect." Over the next 6 hours, humanity's secret fleet worked without rest to pull millions of fellow civilians from their doomed world. When the silence finally consumed the planet, there were still billions left behind because there had not been enough time and not enough ships and not enough anything to save everyone. But humanity had saved more than anyone else could have, and more than anyone else would have even tried. And across the galaxy, the other elder races watched with growing horror as the young species they had dismissed for so long proved that the children had been the only ones paying attention all along. The silence continued to advance, and more worlds fell into the void, and the Galactic Council finally began to understand that everything they had believed about humanity was wrong. The question now was whether that understanding had come too late to matter. The silence came for Sol on a clear morning when Earth's sky was painted with the colors of Sunrise Admiral. Marcus Chun stood on the bridge of humanity's flagship, the Last Dawn, and watched the tactical display as the void consumed the outer reaches of the solar system that had been humanity's home since the beginning. Neptune vanished first, and its blue beauty simply ceased to exist, as if the universe had decided that the ice giant had never been real. Then Uranus disappeared and its rings and moons followed it into nothing. Saturn went next, and humanity watched as the most beautiful planet in their system was erased from existence, and the great rings that had inspired wonder for thousands of years were gone in an instant. "The silence is accelerating," his tactical officer reported, and there was fear in her voice that she could not quite hide. "At current rate of advance, it will reach the inner system within 48 hours. Marcus nodded, and his face was calm despite the terror that gripped his heart. He had known this day would come, and he had spent his entire life preparing for it. And now that it was here, he felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. "Signal all battle groups," he ordered. "Execute Formation Protocol Alpha, and prepare to deploy dimensional anchors on my command." Across the solar system, humanity's hidden fleets emerged from concealment. Battle groups comprising over 3,000 warships rose from the shadows of asteroids and the ice of frozen moons, and they moved into positions that had been calculated decades ago by scientists who knew they might never live to see this moment. On the refugee stations scattered throughout the inner system, the surviving leaders of the Galactic Council watched with disbelief. High Arbiter Desix had escaped the destruction of his homeworld aboard a human evacuation vessel, and now he stood beside thousands of other refugees who owed their lives to the species they had once dismissed as primitive children. "What are they doing?" he asked, and his crystalline form flickered with patterns of confusion. "They cannot fight the silence, and nothing can fight the silence, and we tried everything in our power and nothing worked." A human officer standing nearby turned to face the ancient being. "They are not trying to destroy it," she said quietly. "They are trying to contain it." "That is impossible," Desix insisted. "The silence consumes everything, and it cannot be stopped or slowed or contained by any force we have ever discovered." The human officer smiled, and there was something fierce and proud in her expression. "You spent 200,000 years perfecting what you already knew," she said. "We spent 200 years inventing things that had never existed, and maybe that is the difference." On the bridge of the Last Dawn, Admiral Chun watched as his fleet completed their formation. Ships were arranged in a complex, three-dimensional pattern that would have seemed random to anyone who did not understand the mathematics behind it. But to the scientists who had designed it, the formation was a work of genius. Each vessel carried a dimensional anchor, and when activated, these devices would project fields of stabilized reality that could theoretically slow the advance of the silence. The theory had been tested on a small scale, but no one knew if it would work against the full power of the void. There was only one way to find out. "All ships report ready for deployment," His communications officer announced Marcus looked around his bridge at the men and women who had volunteered to stand between the silence and everything they loved. They were afraid, and he could see it in their eyes, and he could hear it in the slight tremor of their voices, but they were also determined and proud, and ready to do what needed to be done. Open a channel to all ships. Marcus ordered the channel opened, and his voice echoed across every vessel in the fleet. "This is Admiral Chun," he said. "In a few moments we are going to do something that has never been attempted before, and we are going to try to stop a force that has destroyed civilizations older than our species." He paused and took a deep breath. "The odds are not in our favor, and many of us will not survive this day, and I wish I could tell you that victory is certain, but I cannot lie to you, and we all know what we are facing." Across the fleet, crews listened in silence, and hands tightened on controls, and prayers were whispered to whatever gods humanity still believed in. "But I can tell you this," Marcus continued. "We are not fighting for ourselves today, and we are not fighting for glory or conquest or any of the things that drove our ancestors to war, and we are fighting because someone has to stand between the darkness and the light, and because that is what humanity has always done." His voice grew stronger and more certain. "We are the species that survived ice ages and plagues and asteroids, and our own worst impulses, and we are the species that reached for the stars when everyone said it was impossible. And we are the species that prepared for this moment while the rest of the galaxy laughed at us." He looked at the tactical display showing the advancing void. "The silence does not know what it is facing today, and it has consumed ancient civilizations and mighty empires, but it has never faced humanity, and it has never faced a species that refuses to accept that anything is impossible." He straightened in his chair, and his voice rang out with absolute conviction. "All ships, execute Operation Last Light, and let us give this thing something to remember." The fleet moved forward. 3,000 vessels advanced toward the wall of nothing that was consuming everything in its path, and at precisely calculated distances they activated their dimensional anchors. The effect was immediate and extraordinary. Beams of impossible energy lanced out from each ship and connected with the beams from neighboring vessels and created a vast web of stabilized reality that spread across the face of the silence. The void slowed for the first time since it had begun its advance across the galaxy. The silence encountered something that resisted it, but the cost was terrible. The strain on the dimensional anchors was immense, and ships began to fail under the pressure. The destroyer Valiant was the first to go, and her hull crumpled like paper, and her crew of 300 died in an instant. Then, the cruiser Hope's fire followed, and then a dozen more ships, and then 100. "Maintain formation," Marcus ordered, and his voice never wavered even as he watched his fleet being torn apart. "Reinforce the weak points, and do not let the barrier fall." On the refugee stations, the watching aliens could not believe what they were seeing. Humanity was dying by the thousands, and their ships were being destroyed, and their people were screaming as they were crushed by forces they barely understood, and still they did not retreat. "Why won't they run?" A council observer sobbed, and she was of the Sari, who had spent centuries dismissing humans as primitive. "Why are they throwing away their lives?" "High Arbiter." Essex watched in silence, and for the first time in his 50,000 years of existence, he understood something he had never grasped before. "Because they are buying time," he said quietly. "They know they cannot win, and they know most of them will die, but every second they hold the barrier is another second for others to escape." The battle raged for 3 days. Humanity lost 2,000 ships and over 1 million lives. With the barrier held, and slowly, impossibly, the silence began to contract as the dimensional anchors forced it back into a smaller and smaller space. On the bridge of the last dawn, Marcus Chun watched the final readings come in, and a smile crossed his exhausted face. "It is working," he whispered. "The barrier is holding." Then a structural beam collapsed and everything went dark. His Last thought was of Elena Vasquez and her granddaughter, Yuki, and all the humans who had worked so hard to reach this moment. They had done it. Humanity had faced the impossible and refused to accept defeat, and the universe would never forget. The battle for Seoul lasted 3 days, and when it was over, the galaxy had changed forever. Admiral Yuki Vasquez stood on the observation deck of the orbital station, Unity, and looked out at what remained of humanity's fleet of the 3,000 ships that had advanced against the Silence. Fewer than 200 had survived, and of the 1,000,000 men and women who had crewed those vessels, barely 10,000 still drew breath. The cost had been catastrophic beyond imagining, but through the viewport she could see something that made every sacrifice worthwhile. Earth hung in the darkness of space, and its blue oceans and green continents and white clouds looked exactly as they had for billions of years, and the small world that had given birth to humanity still existed, and beyond Earth, contained within a prison of shimmering energy that stretched across millions of kilometers. The Silence had stopped. It had not been destroyed because nothing could destroy the Silence, but it had been contained, and the dimensional anchors that humanity had created now held it in a cage of stabilized reality that prevented it from expanding further. As Barol, her aide, said quietly, "The Galactic Council is requesting communication, and High Arbiter Desix says it is urgent." Yuki nodded slowly and turned away from the viewport. She had not slept in 4 days, and her body ached with exhaustion and grief, and the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. But she was a Vasquez, and her grandmother had taught her that duty did not wait for rest. She walked to the communication center and activated the link to the Council refugee station. The faces that appeared on her screen were nothing like the arrogant beings her grandmother had described from her years as ambassador. High Arbiter Desix looked diminished somehow, and his crystalline form had lost its brilliant luster, and the patterns that played across his surface spoke of confusion and humility. Behind him, representatives of a dozen species watched with expressions ranging from shock to awe to something that might have been shame. "Admiral Vasquez," Desix said, and his voice lacked any trace of the condescension that had marked every previous communication between his people and humanity. "On behalf of the Galactic Council, I wish to express our gratitude for what your species has done." Yuki was silent for a moment, and she thought of her grandmother, standing in that great chamber, being mocked and dismissed for trying to save the very beings who now thanked her granddaughter. "The Silence is contained," she said finally. "Our scientists estimate that the barrier will hold for approximately 500 years before it requires reinforcement, and we have transmitted all technical specifications to the Council, and we suggest you use that time wisely." Desix nodded, and the motion seemed to cost him something. "We have studied your data," he said, "and we do not understand how you developed this technology, and your species has only been spacefaring for 3 centuries, and we have had 200 millennia to advance, and yet you created weapons we could not imagine. We had motivation." Yuki replied simply, "We knew what was coming, and we knew no one else was preparing, and desperation is a powerful teacher." Another council member stepped forward, and Yuki recognized him as a Velith who had once served as a senior diplomat admiral. He said, and his mechanical voice carried none of the mockery that had characterized his species' interactions with humanity, "I must ask a question that has troubled us since we witnessed your fleet advance against the Silence. Ask, why did you save us?" He said, and the question seemed to cause him physical pain. "We treated your people with contempt for generations, and we blocked your advancement, and we refused to share knowledge, and we laughed when your ambassador warned us of this threat. And when the Silence came, you sent ships to evacuate our people even as your own world faced destruction." Yuki looked at the gathered representatives of galactic civilization, and she saw beings who had ruled the stars for longer than humanity had existed as a species. They had built empires and developed technologies beyond human comprehension, and they had considered themselves the pinnacle of evolution. And now they stood humbled before a species they had dismissed as primitive children. "My grandmother spent 30 years trying to warn you," Yuki said. "She stood in your chambers and presented evidence and begged for your cooperation, and every time she was rejected and mocked and sent away." She paused, and her voice grew stronger. She could have become bitter and hateful, and she could have decided that species who treated her people with such contempt deserved whatever fate befell them. But she did not. Yuki stepped closer to the screen. She believed that the measure of a species is not how long they have existed or how advanced their technology is or how many worlds they rule, and she believed that what matters is what a species is willing to sacrifice for others, even for others who never believed in them. Physics's form flickered with colors that no human had ever seen before. "She was right about everything," he said quietly. "The silence and our complacency and our arrogance, and we should have listened. And we should have helped, and instead we wasted decades while your people prepared alone." "Yes," Yuki agreed. "You should have, and you did not, and millions died because of your pride." The council members flinched at her words, but none of them tried to argue. "But that is in the past," Yuki continued. "The silence is contained for now, but it is not defeated, and in 500 years, the barrier will need to be reinforced, and whatever comes after that will require all of us working together." She looked at each of the alien faces on her screen. "Humanity did not save the galaxy so that we could rule it or demand tribute or force you to bow before us, and we saved it because that is who we are, and because we believe that every species deserves a chance to grow and learn and become something better." "High Arbiter." Desix moved forward, and his crystalline form seemed to glow with new light. "What would you have us do?" he asked. "How can we honor what humanity has sacrificed?" Yuki smiled, and it was the same smile her grandmother had worn when she walked out of the council chamber for the last time. "Remember," she said, "remember that the young species you dismissed as children were the only ones who saw the darkness coming, and remember that we tried to warn you, and remember that we came to save you anyway." She straightened, and her voice carried across the light years with absolute clarity. "And next time someone small and young and seemingly insignificant comes to you with a warning about something they have seen, then maybe listen, because you never know which species will be the one to save everyone." The transmission ended, and Yuki turned back to the viewport below her. Earth continued its eternal rotation, and somewhere down there the descendants of the humans who had first looked up at the stars were looking up again. They had paid a terrible price for the galaxy's survival, and they had lost friends and family and an entire generation of their best and brightest. But they had done what they set out to do. And across the galaxy, on 1,000 worlds that would have been consumed by the silenced beings of every species, looked up at the stars with new understanding. The humans had been right all along. The children had saved them all, and the universe would never forget the species from the small blue world, who had stood against the darkness when no one else would. On Earth, the survivors began to rebuild, and in laboratories and shipyards, new projects commenced. Because humanity had learned something in their short, violent, beautiful history. There was always another threat on the horizon, and when it came, they would be ready. They would always be ready. That was what it meant to be human.